In the quiet of Cloverfield, Oregon, a scruffy mutt named Rusty unearths a chilling secret buried in the Thompsons' backyard, pulling the family into a web of mystery and danger. Each clue he digs up unravels the past of a woman long lost, while his loyal heart binds a fractured family together. As shadows watch from the woods, Rusty's courage lights the way to truth and redemption. Will his nose for justice uncover the final piece before the threat closes in? The air in Cloverfield, Oregon, carried the sharp scent of pine and damp earth, the kind that clung to your clothes and made every breath feel like a promise. Laura Thompson stood on the porch of their new home, a two-story craftsman with chipped blue paint and a wide backyard that stretched into a tangle of woods. It was early September 2025, and the leaves were just starting to blush red at the edges. She sipped her coffee, the mug warm against her palms, and watched the street where neighbors waved from their mailboxes. This was their fresh start, a chance to stitch together the frayed edges of their lives. Inside, the house buzzed with the chaos of a family still finding its rhythm. Laura's husband, Mark, was in the kitchen, flipping pancakes with a precision that came from years as a volunteer firefighter. His laugh, deep and steady, cut through the clatter of plates. "Jake, you gonna eat these or just stare at your phone?" he called, glancing at Laura's 13-year-old son from her first marriage. Jake sat at the table, his dark hair falling over his eyes, scrolling through a music app with a frown. He'd been quiet since the move from Portland, his world upended by new schools and the absence of old friends. "Not hungry," he muttered, but he slid his phone into his pocket when Mark raised an eyebrow. Sophie, Laura's 6-year-old daughter, was a whirlwind of glitter and giggles, dancing around the living room in a tutu she refused to take off. "Mommy, can we get a puppy today? Please, please, please," she sang, twirling until she bumped into the couch. Her obsession with dogs had started with a library book about a golden retriever who saved a town, and now every conversation circled back to floppy ears and wagging tails. Laura smiled, brushing a curl from Sophie's face. "Soon, sweetheart. Let's get settled first." The move to Cloverfield had been a leap of faith. After Laura's divorce 3 years ago, she and Mark had married quickly, blending their lives with hope and a touch of fear. Jake had struggled with the change, missing his dad and resenting the new house that felt too big, too quiet. Sophie, though, saw every day as an adventure, her chatter filling the gaps left by Jake's silence. Mark, with his steady hands and endless patience, was the glue holding them together. He'd grown up in a small town like this one, and when he suggested leaving the city for a place where stars outnumbered streetlights, Laura had agreed. Cloverfield, 40 minutes from Eugene, was their chance to become a family, not just a collection of people sharing a roof. The house itself was a fixer-upper, bought at auction after the previous owners, a reclusive couple, left it vacant. The backyard was the real draw, sprawling and wild, bordered by a low wooden fence and a thicket of fir trees. Laura imagined summer barbecues, Sophie chasing fireflies, Jake maybe even smiling again. But there was something about the yard that felt alive, watchful, like it held stories the realtor hadn't mentioned. The first night, Laura had noticed how the wind seemed to whisper through the trees, a sound that wasn't quite a howl, but close enough to make her pause. Inside, the family was still unpacking boxes labeled fragile and miscellaneous, their lives a jumble of old photos and new dreams. Jake had claimed the attic room, its slanted ceiling perfect for brooding. Sophie's bedroom was a riot of stuffed animals, each one named after a dog breed she'd memorized. Mark and Laura took the master suite, where they'd lie awake at night, whispering about how to make this work. "Jake'll come around," Mark said last night, his arm around her. "He just needs time. Maybe something to care about." Laura agreed. Jake had always been sensitive, the kind of kid who'd cry over a hurt bird but hide it behind a scowl. The move had hit him hard, and school wasn't helping. New faces, new rules, no one to sit with at lunch. Sophie, on the other hand, had already made friends with the neighbor's cat and declared Cloverfield the best place ever. Laura wanted something to bridge the gap between her kids, to give them a shared purpose. Mark suggested a dog. "It'll teach them responsibility," he said, "and Sophie's going to explode if we don't get one soon." The idea had taken root. Laura remembered her childhood beagle, Rusty, who'd followed her everywhere, his tail a metronome of joy. A dog could be the spark they needed, something to make the house feel like home. She'd found a shelter nearby, just outside town, and planned a visit for the weekend. The thought of it warmed her, a flicker of hope in a season of change. As she stepped back inside, Sophie tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, can the puppy sleep in my room? I'll share my blanket." Jake rolled his eyes but didn't look away, a tiny crack in his armor. Mark caught Laura's gaze and winked, flipping another pancake onto a plate. The morning sun streamed through the window, catching the dust motes in a golden haze. Outside, the woods stood silent, waiting. For now, the Thompson family was a work in progress, their new life in Cloverfield a blank page. But Laura felt it in her bones. Something was coming, something that would bind them tighter than any house or promise could. She just didn't know it would start with a scruffy mutt and a secret buried in the earth. The Cloverfield Animal Shelter sat just off Highway 17, a low brick building surrounded by wildflowers and a chain-link fence. Laura pulled the family's SUV into the gravel lot on a crisp Saturday morning, the sky a brilliant blue that made the world feel full of possibility. Sophie bounced in her booster seat, clutching a dog-eared picture book about a heroic retriever. "We're going to find the best puppy ever," she declared, her voice loud enough to make Mark chuckle from the driver's seat. Jake slouched beside her, earbuds in, but Laura caught him glancing out the window, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on his knee. Inside, the shelter smelled of hay and disinfectant, with a faint undertone of wet fur. A volunteer named Clara, her grey braids swinging as she moved, greeted them with a warm smile. "Looking for a new family member?" she asked, eyeing Sophie's book. Sophie nodded vigorously, launching into a monologue about how she'd teach her dog to fetch and sleep under her bed. Clara laughed, then turned to Laura and Mark. "Any preferences? Big, small, young, old?" Laura hesitated, glancing at Jake, who was studying a poster about spaying and neutering with exaggerated interest. "We want someone who'll fit with us," she said. "Maybe a dog who needs a home as much as we need them." Mark squeezed her hand and Clara nodded, her eyes softening. She led them past rows of kennels, where dogs barked, whined, or pressed hopeful noses against the bars. Sophie darted from one to the next, cooing at a floppy-eared beagle and a wiry terrier with a missing tooth. Mark lingered by a stately German shepherd, but Laura noticed Jake hanging back, his hands stuffed in his hoodie pockets. "You okay, Bud?" she asked quietly. He shrugged, muttering, "They're all fine, I guess." Then they reached the last kennel in the row. Inside, a scruffy black and tan mutt lay curled on a faded blanket, his muzzle tucked under his tail. He was medium-sized, with a slight limp when he shifted, and his fur was a patchwork of wiry curls and smooth patches, like he'd been stitched together from different dogs. His eyes, a warm amber, lifted to meet theirs, and something in them made Laura pause, intelligence maybe, or a kind of quiet knowing. "This is Rusty," Clara said, crouching by the kennel. "Found him about a month ago near an old logging trail up by Blackthorn Ridge. No collar, no chip, just wandering alone. Vet thinks he's around 4 or 5, maybe part hound, part something else. He's got a bit of a limp from an old injury, but it doesn't slow him down much." Sophie knelt by the bars, her nose inches from the gate. "Hi, Rusty, I'm Sophie." The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Laura expected her to move on to the next kennel, but then Jake stepped forward, his earbuds dangling from his hand. He crouched beside Sophie, his voice low. "Hey boy, you just chilling in there?" Rusty's head lifted, and he stood, his tail giving a slow, deliberate wag. He limped to the gate and pressed his nose against the bars, right where Jake's hand rested. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the shelter's noise, barks, footsteps, Sophie's chatter, faded away. Jake's face softened, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "He's cool," he said, almost to himself. Clara raised an eyebrow. "That's the most interest Rusty's shown in anyone. He's been here a while, keeps to himself mostly, but looks like he's got a favorite." She opened the gate and Rusty stepped out, sniffing Jake's sneakers before sitting at his feet. Sophie clapped, but Rusty's gaze stayed on Jake, steady and sure, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. Laura's heart did a little flip. She glanced at Mark, who nodded, a grin spreading across his face. "What do you think, guys?" he asked. Sophie was already hugging Rusty's neck, declaring him the best dog in the whole world. Jake didn't say anything, but he scratched Rusty's ears, his fingers lingering in the dog's fur. That was answer enough. Clara walked them through the paperwork, sharing what little she knew about Rusty's past. He was skinny when we found him, but healthy otherwise. Kept looking back at the trail, like he expected someone to follow. Never barked much, just watched. I think he's been waiting for the right people. As they loaded Rusty into the SUV, his leash looped loosely in Jake's hand, Laura felt a warmth settle in her chest. The shelter's gravel crunched under their tires as they pulled away, Rusty's head poking out the window, his ears flapping in the breeze. Sophie sang a made-up song about Rusty the Brave, and even Jake laughed when the dog sneezed at a passing cloud. Mark reached for Laura's hand, his voice low. "This feels right, doesn't it?" It did. But as they turned onto their street, Laura noticed Rusty's posture shift. He sat up in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the house. The Thompson house hummed with a new kind of energy as Rusty stepped through the front door, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Laura watched him pause in the foyer, his amber eyes scanning the space like he was memorizing every detail. The creaky staircase, the stack of unpacked boxes, the faint scent of Mark's morning pancakes lingering in the air. Sophie, still, clutching her dogbook, dropped to her knees and flung her arms around Rusty's neck. "Welcome home, Rusty. You're gonna love it here," she squealed, her tutu sparkling under the hallway light. Rusty's tail gave a slow wag, but his gaze darted toward the back of the house, where the sliding glass door opened to the sprawling backyard. Jake, trailing behind with Rusty's leash still in hand, looked less guarded than usual. "He's probably freaked out," he said, kneeling to unclip the leash. "New place and all." But there was a softness in his voice, a flicker of pride that he'd been the one Rusty chose at the shelter. Mark set a bowl of water on the kitchen floor, grinning. "Give him time, Jake. He'll be ruling the roost by tomorrow." Laura had spent the morning preparing for Rusty's arrival. A plush dog bed sat in the corner of the living room, next to a basket of toys Sophie had picked out. A squeaky bone, a frayed rope, and a rubber ball that smelled faintly of bacon. She'd read online about easing a rescue dog into a new home, so she kept the noise low, shushing Sophie's louder outbursts. But Rusty didn't seem nervous. He moved with a quiet purpose, sniffing along the baseboards, his limping gait barely noticeable. He explored the kitchen, circled the dining table, and paused by the couch, where Jake had tossed his hoodie. Rusty gave it a long sniff, then looked up at Jake with what Laura could only describe as approval. "He likes you," she said, nudging Jake's shoulder. He shrugged, but a shy smile broke through. "Yeah, well, he's not bad either." Sophie, undeterred by Rusty's calm demeanor, grabbed the squeaky bone and waved it in front of him. "Come on, Rusty, play." Rusty tilted his head, his ears twitching, but instead of lunging for the toy, he trotted toward the back door and sat, his nose inches from the glass. He let out a soft whine, barely audible, his eyes fixed on the backyard. The woods beyond. The fence loomed dark and still, their branches swaying faintly in the late afternoon breeze. Mark joined him, peering out. "What's out there, buddy? Squirrel, rabbit?" He slid the door open, expecting Rusty to bolt, but the dog didn't move. He just stared, his tail stiff, his body taut like a coiled spring. Laura felt a prickle of unease. "Maybe he just needs to get used to the yard," she said, more to herself than anyone else. She stepped outside, patting her thigh. "Come on, Rusty, let's check it out." Rusty followed her onto the grass, his nose low to the ground. The backyard was bigger than it looked from the house, a patchwork of clover and dandelions bordered by a sagging wooden fence. The woods pressed close, their shadows stretching long as the sun dipped. Rusty ignored the open space and made a beeline for the far corner, near an old stump, half covered in moss. He sniffed intently, circling the stump twice before sitting again, his whine sharper this time. Jake wandered out, hands in his pockets. "What's he doing?" he asked, squinting at Rusty. Laura shrugged, but her unease grew. Rusty's focus was unnerving, like he saw something no one else could. Sophie skipped over, waving her book. Maybe he's looking for treasure, like in my story. Her enthusiasm broke the tension, and Laura laughed, ruffling her hair. Maybe, sweetie, or maybe he's just curious. They spent the rest of the afternoon settling Rusty in. Sophie insisted on showing him every room, dragging the squeaky bone behind her. Jake stayed close, tossing the rubber ball gently in the living room. Rusty caught it once, his limp barely slowing him, and dropped it at Jake's feet, earning a rare grin from the boy. Mark set up a water bowl in the laundry room, where Rusty's bed would stay for now. "We'll see if he likes it there," he said, but Laura suspected Rusty would end up wherever Jake was. As evening fell, the house grew cozy, the smell of Mark's lasagna filling the air. Sophie drew a picture of Rusty with crayons, taping it to the fridge under a magnet shaped like a heart. Jake played a game on his phone, but kept one eye on Rusty, who'd returned to the back door, lying with his chin on his paws, still watching the yard. Laura tried to ignore the knot in her stomach. "He'll settle," she told Mark, who nodded but didn't look convinced. That night, after Sophie was tucked in with her stuffed Dalmatian and Jake had retreated to his attic room, Laura and Mark sat on the couch, a glass of wine between them. Rusty's bed was empty. He'd followed Jake upstairs and curled up on an old blanket at the foot of his. But downstairs in the quiet, Laura heard it, a low, plaintive whine from the direction of the back door. She crept to the kitchen, her socks silent on the floor, and found Rusty standing by the glass, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. He didn't turn when she approached, just whined again, softer, like a question. "Rusty, what is it?" she whispered, kneeling beside him. His tail flicked once, but he didn't budge. His gaze locked on that corner of the yard, on the stump that seemed to call him. The woods were silent now, no wind, no whispers, just a stillness that felt heavy, expectant. Laura's heart thudded. She didn't believe in omens, but something about Rusty's focus made her wonder what he'd seen on that logging trail, what he'd carried with him to this house. She locked the door, double-checked it, and coaxed Rusty back to Jake's room. He went reluctantly, glancing over his shoulder. As she climbed into bed, Mark stirred. "He okay?" he mumbled. "Yeah," Laura said, but her voice wavered. "Just adjusting." But deep down, she knew Rusty wasn't adjusting. He was searching. The Sunday morning sun filtered through, the kitchen curtains casting a warm glow over the Thompson family's breakfast table. Laura poured orange juice, while Mark flipped bacon in a sizzling pan, the smoky aroma mixing with Sophie's chatter about teaching Rusty to roll over. Jake, still in his pajama pants, sat slouched with a piece of toast, his eyes half open but brighter than they'd been in weeks. Rusty, who'd spent the night curled at the foot of Jake's bed, lay under the table, his head resting on Jake's bare feet. The scene felt almost perfect, a snapshot of the family Laura had hoped they'd become. But when she glanced at Rusty, she noticed his ears twitch, his gaze drifting toward the back door again. "Think he needs to go out?" Mark asked, following her look. Laura nodded, setting down her glass. "I'll take him. Jake, wanna come?" Jake hesitated, then shrugged, grabbing Rusty's leash from the counter. Sure, the backyard was cool and damp, the grass glistening with dew. Rusty trotted ahead, his limp barely noticeable, and made a beeline for the same corner he'd fixated on the day before, the old stump near the fence, its gnarled roots clawing into the earth. Laura expected him to sniff around and move on, but instead he began to dig. Not a casual scratch, but a frantic, determined clawing, his paws flinging dirt in a steady rhythm. Clumps of earth flew and his tail stayed rigid, his focus absolute. "Whoa, Rusty, what's the deal?" Jake said, crouching beside him. Laura joined them, her sneakers sinking into the soft ground. Rusty's digging grew more intense, his nose buried in the hole he was creating. After a minute, his paw hit something solid with a dull thunk. He stopped, sat back, and let out a sharp bark, his eyes locked on the spot. Laura's pulse quickened. "Jake, grab that trowel from the shed," she said, pointing to the small gardening shed near the garage. Jake sprinted off and returned. With the tool, his usual apathy replaced by curiosity. Laura knelt, brushing dirt aside with her hands, before using the trowel to dig deeper. The earth gave way to reveal a rusted metal box, no bigger than a shoebox, its surface pitted and stained. Rusty whined, nudging her arm with his nose. "What is that?" Jake asked, his voice low, almost reverent. Laura pried the lid open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, nestled in a bed of moldy fabric, was a faded photograph and a small silver locket engraved with the initials E.M. The photo showed a young woman with auburn hair, smiling beside a dog that looked uncannily like Rusty, same black and tan fur, same soulful eyes. The woman's arm was around the dog, and they stood in front of a fence that Laura recognized as their own. Her stomach twisted. "Mark!" she called, her voice sharper than intended. Mark appeared at the back door, Sophie trailing behind with a juice-stained mouth. "What's going on?" he asked, crossing the yard. Laura held up the box, showing him the contents. His brow furrowed as he took the photo, turning it over. On the back, in faint pencil, was written, "Emily and Scout, Summer." "This isn't just junk," Laura said quietly. "This feels important." Sophie peered into the box, her eyes wide. "Is that Rusty's mom?" she asked, pointing at the dog in the photo. Jake snorted, but his gaze stayed on the locket, his fingers twitching like he wanted to touch it. Mark set the box on the picnic table and studied the locket, popping it open. Inside was a tiny photo of the same woman, her smile softer, almost sad. "We need to call someone," he said, his firefighter instincts kicking in. "This could be something serious." Laura nodded, her mind racing. She'd heard stories about houses holding secrets, old letters, forgotten heirlooms, but this felt different, heavier. Rusty sat by the stump, his tail still, his eyes flicking between the box and the woods beyond the fence. His calm was unnerving, like he'd known exactly what he'd find. Within an hour, Sheriff Daniels, a stocky man with a graying mustache, stood in their backyard, his boots sinking into the grass. He examined the box, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. "E.M., he muttered, turning the locket over. "Could be Emily Monroe. She went missing around here 15 years ago. Lived a few streets over. Case went cold, but folks still talk about it." Laura's breath caught. "Missing?" Jake, standing close to Rusty, looked up, his face pale. Sophie clung to Mark's leg, her earlier excitement replaced by confusion. "Was she lost?" she asked, her voice small. Daniels crouched, his knees cracking, and gave Sophie a gentle smile. "Something like that, kiddo. But don't you worry." He straightened, turning to Laura and Mark. "Mind if I take this to the station? We'll run some tests, see if it's connected. And keep an eye on that dog of yours. Seems he's got a nose for trouble." As Daniels left with the box, Laura felt the air shift, like the house itself was holding its breath. Rusty pressed against Jake's leg, his warmth a quiet reassurance. Jake scratched his ears, muttering, "Good boy." Sophie tugged at Laura's sleeve. "Rusty's a hero, right, Mummy?" Laura forced a smile, but her mind was on the photo. The locket, the woman who'd vanished. What had Rusty brought into their lives? Back inside, the family sat in silence, the breakfast dishes forgotten. Mark broke the tension, clapping his hands. "Okay, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Could be nothing, right?" But his eyes met Laura's, and she saw the same question there. What else is out there? Rusty, lying by the back door, let out a soft huff, his gaze still fixed on the yard, on the stump, on something only he could sense. The Thompson household felt different by Monday morning, as if the discovery of the rusted box had shifted its foundations. Laura stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes with mechanical precision, her eyes drifting to the backyard where yellow crime scene tape fluttered around the old stump. The sheriff's deputies had returned the previous afternoon, combing the area with gloved hands and metal detectors. They'd found nothing new, but the tape remained, a stark reminder that their home was now part of something bigger. Rusty lay by the sliding glass door, his chin on his paws, watching the yard with the same intensity he'd shown since arriving. Sophie, perched at the table with a bowl of cereal, was undeterred by the tension. "Rusty's like a detective," Right, Mummy? He found a clue, she said, swinging her spoon and splattering milk. Laura managed to smile, drying her hands on a towel. He sure did, sweetie. But let's focus on getting you to school, okay? Sophie nodded, already launching into a story about how Rusty would solve mysteries with a cape. Jake, slouched in his chair, was quieter than usual. He'd been texting his friends back in Portland, but now his phone lay untouched, his gaze flickering to Rusty. They think it's really her? That Emily lady? He asked, his voice low so Sophie wouldn't hear. Laura hesitated, glancing at Mark, who was packing lunches with a forced calm. Sheriff Daniels thinks it's possible, Mark said, zipping Sophie's lunchbox. But they need to run tests on the locket and photo. Could take a while. He met Jake's eyes, offering a reassuring nod. Don't worry, bud, they'll figure it out. Jake didn't look convinced. He reached down to scratch Rusty's ears, and the dog leaned into his hand, a soft whine escaping. Laura watched the exchange, her heart swelling. Jake had been so withdrawn since the move, but Rusty was cracking his shell, giving him something to hold on to amidst the uncertainty. The deputies had left a card with Sheriff Daniels' number, and Laura called him after dropping Sophie at kindergarten and Jake at middle school. Any updates? She asked, cradling the phone while Rusty paced the living room. Daniels' voice was steady but guarded. The locket's a match for one Emily Monroe was known to wear. We found a keychain buried a few feet from the stump. 2 has her initials. Forensics is testing for prints, DNA, anything that might tell us more. Laura's grip tightened on the phone. What about the dog in the photo? Could it be Rusty? Daniels paused, the silence heavy. Hard to say. The dog, Scout according to the photo, was hers, but that was 15 years ago. Rusty's too young to be the same dog, but the resemblance is uncanny. We're looking into it. Hanging up, Laura felt a chill despite the morning sun streaming through the windows. She glanced at Rusty, who'd stopped pacing and was now staring at the back door again, his tail stiff. What do you know, boy? She whispered, half expecting an answer. He only whined, pressing his nose to the glass. When Mark got home from his shift at the fire station, he found Laura in the backyard, staring at the taped-off stump. Rusty was at her side, his ears pricked. You okay? Mark asked, wrapping an arm around her. She leaned into him, her voice shaky. This is our home, Mark. We moved here to start over, and now it's like we're living in someone else's story. He squeezed her shoulder. We'll get through it. And hey, Rusty's part of our story now. Look at him, he's already... Got Jake smiling, Sophie dreaming. That's something. Laura nodded, watching Rusty sniff the air, his focus unwavering. Mark was right. Rusty was knitting them together, even as he unraveled a mystery. That evening, the neighborhood began to buzz. A neighbor, Mrs. Larson, stopped by with a plate of cookies and a curious glint in her eye. Heard about what your dog found, she said, her white hair catching the porch light. Folks say Emily used to walk her dog in those woods. Sweet girl, taught at the elementary school. Broke everyone's heart when she vanished. Laura invited her in, and Mrs. Larson sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded. That house of yours, the couple who lived here before, the Warrens, kept to themselves. Left in a hurry after Emily went missing. Never thought much of it till now. Laura's skin prickled. You think they knew something? Mrs. Larson shrugged, her eyes drifting to Rusty, who'd curled up near Jake on the couch. Maybe. Or maybe that dog of yours knows more than we do. Jake, listening from the living room, looked up, his fingers pausing in Rusty's fur. He's just a dog, he said. But there was a question in his voice, like he wasn't sure anymore. Sophie, coloring at the table, piped up. Rusty's a hero dog. He's going to find more clues. Mrs. Larson chuckled, but Laura caught the unease in her glance toward the backyard. As night fell, the house grew quiet, the crime scene tape a ghostly outline in the moonlight. Laura tucked Sophie in, reading an extra chapter of her dog book to ease her questions about the lost lady. Jake lingered in the hallway, Rusty at his heels. Mom, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What if Rusty finds something? Else something bad? Laura knelt, meeting his eyes. Then we'll handle it together. You, me, Mark, Sophie, and Rusty, okay? He nodded, but his hand stayed on Rusty's head, like the dog was his anchor. She watched them climb the stairs. Rusty's limp a soft rhythm on the wood. Alone in the kitchen, Laura checked the locks, her gaze lingering on the backyard. The stump seemed to pulse in the dark, a silent challenge. Rusty's whine echoed from upstairs, and she knew he was at Jake's window, watching, waiting. The mystery of Emily Monroe had cracked their world open, and Rusty was at its heart, pulling them deeper with every glance toward the woods. The Thompson house felt like it, was holding its breath in the days following the discovery of Emily Monroe's locket and photograph. The crime scene tape around the backyard stump fluttered in the Oregon breeze, a constant reminder of the mystery that had taken root in their new life. Yet, amidst the unease, a warmth was growing, stitched together by Rusty's presence. Laura noticed it in the small moments. Sophie's laughter brighter, Jake's silences shorter, Mark's steady hand guiding them all. The dog, with his limping gait and soulful eyes, was becoming their center, and the mystery was giving them a shared purpose. Tuesday evening, the family gathered in the living room, the coffee table covered with Sophie's crayons and Jake's spiral notebook. Sophie had declared it Detective Rusty Night, her idea to help Rusty solve the case. She sat cross-legged on the rug, drawing a picture of Rusty with a magnifying glass, his black and tan fur rendered in bold marker strokes. "He's gonna find the lost lady's secrets," she announced, taping her masterpiece to the fridge beside her earlier sketch. Rusty, lying nearby, thumped his tail, as if approving her creativity. Jake, sprawled on the couch, flipped open his notebook, which he'd labeled Rusty's Clues in Sharpie. "Okay, so we've got the box, the locket with EM, and the photo of Emily with a dog that looks like Rusty," he said, his voice carrying a new confidence. "And that keychain the cops found, what's it all mean?" He glanced at Rusty, who lifted his head, ears twitching like he was part of the brainstorming session. Laura, curled in an armchair with a mug of tea, felt a swell of pride. Jake hadn't been this engaged in anything since the move. "Good. Question?" she said, leaning forward. "Sheriff Daniels said the locket and keychain belonged to Emily Monroe, but why were they buried here? And why did Rusty know where to dig?" Mark, sitting beside Sophie, tossed a squeaky bone to Rusty, who caught it gently and dropped it at Jake's feet. "Maybe the dog in the photo, Scout, was Rusty's ancestor or something," Mark suggested. "Could be why he's so tuned. Say into this spot." He grinned at Sophie, who clapped. "Rusty's a superhero with a superpower nose." The idea sparked a debate, with Sophie insisting Rusty was magic and Jake countering that dogs just had crazy good instincts. Laura watched them, her heart lifting. The mystery, unsettling as it was, had given them something to rally around. Even Mark, usually the pragmatic one, seemed caught up in the excitement, sketching a rough map of the backyard in Jake's notebook, marking the stump with an X. "If Rusty found one box, there could be more," he said, half joking. "Rusty," barked softly as if in agreement, and the room erupted in laughter. Later, as they cleared the table, Laura suggested a family walk with Rusty to clear their heads. The evening air was crisp, the Cloverfield streets lined with maples glowing under streetlights. Rusty trotted ahead, his leash loose in Jake's hand, sniffing mailboxes and pausing at corners. Sophie skipped beside them, recounting her dog book's plot, while Mark and Laura trailed behind, their hands brushing. "This is good," Mark said quietly. "The kids, us, Rusty, feels like we're becoming a team." Laura nodded, watching Jake kneel to let Rusty sniff a patch of grass. "I was so worried about Jake," she admitted. "But look at him with Rusty, he's present." Mark squeezed her hand. "That dog's doing more than digging up old boxes, he's digging up us." Back home, Sophie begged for a bedtime story, and Laura chose one about a dog who led his family to safety. Rusty curled up on the rug beside Sophie's bed, his eyes half closed but alert, as if listening. When Laura tucked Jake in, he was still clutching his notebook, a pencil tucked behind his ear. "Rusty slept by my window last night," he said, almost shyly. "Kept looking outside. Think he's guarding us?" Laura smoothed his hair, her throat tight. "I think he's making sure we're all okay." Jake nodded, his fingers brushing Rusty's collar, which he'd left on his nightstand. "He's cool, Mum, really cool." As Laura and Mark settled into bed, the house quiet except for the hum of the heater, she couldn't shake the image. of Rusty at the back door, his whine echoing in her mind. The mystery of Emily Munro was a shadow over their home, but it was also a spark, drawing them closer. She thought of Sophie's drawings, Jake's notebook, the way Mark had laughed when Rusty nudged him for a treat. Rusty wasn't just a pet. He was a bridge, connecting their fractured pieces. Downstairs she heard a faint sound, a soft whine, then the click of nails on the floor. Peering over the stair railing, she saw Rusty at the back door, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. He sat staring at the stump, the woods, the secret still buried. Laura's heart thudded, but she didn't call him back. She knew now. Rusty wasn't just settling in. He was leading them somewhere, and they were following together. The Thompson family woke to a Wednesday morning draped in fog, the kind that blurred the edges of Cloverfield streets and made the woods behind their house look like a painting smudged with grey. Laura stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching Rusty pace the backyard. He'd been restless since dawn, ignoring his breakfast kibble and returning again and again to the stump, now free of crime scene tape but still marked by churned earth. His limping gait was more pronounced in the damp air, but his focus was unwavering, his nose low to the ground as if tracing an invisible thread. Sophie, already dressed in her favorite dog-themed sweatshirt, pressed her face to the glass beside Laura. "Rusty's on a mission, Mummy. He's going to find another clue," she said, her breath fogging the window. Laura smiled, but her stomach tightened. The locket and photograph had already turned their lives upside down. What else could Rusty unearth? Jake, slinging his backpack over one shoulder, paused by the door. "He's been weird all morning," he said, his voice laced with curiosity. "Kept scratching at my door before I even woke up." Mark, tying his boots for a shift at the fire station, glanced at Rusty through the window. "Maybe he's just bored," he offered, but his tone lacked conviction. He kissed Laura's forehead, then ruffled Sophie's hair. "Keep an eye on our detective, okay, Soph?" She giggled, saluting him, but Laura caught the flicker of worry in his eyes as he left. After dropping the kids at school, Laura leashed Rusty for a walk, hoping to distract him from the backyard. But he pulled hard, his usual lazy trot replaced by a determined stride, leading her not down the street but toward the woods beyond the fence. The path was narrow, overgrown with ferns and blackberry vines, and the fog clung to the trees like a shroud. Rusty's ears were pricked, his tail stiff, and Laura felt a prickle of unease. "Easy, boy," she murmured, tightening her grip on the leash. But Rusty stopped abruptly at a hollow tree, its trunk split like an open book. He sniffed the base, then pawed at the ground, letting out a low, insistent bark. Laura's heart skipped. She knelt, brushing away leaves and dirt, her fingers grazing something hard. It was a small bundle, wrapped in weathered plastic, tied with twine. Rusty sat back, his amber eyes fixed on her as she carefully untied it. Inside was a single page, torn from a journal, the ink faded but legible. The handwriting was neat, feminine. "The red shed by the creek. Carter's hiding something there. I can't trust him anymore." Below, in a shakier scrawl, "Scout knows." Laura's breath caught. Emily Munro's words, preserved in the earth, and Rusty had led her straight to them. She tucked the page into her jacket, her mind racing. The red shed. Hadn't Mrs. Larson mentioned it? A crumbling structure on a nearby property, abandoned for years. And Carter, who was he? Rusty nudged her hand, his nose cold against her skin, and she stroked his head, her voice trembling. "You're something else, aren't you?" He whined softly, as if urging her to move. Back home, Laura called Sheriff Daniels, her hands shaking as she read him the journal page over the phone. "Carter's probably Carter Hayes," Daniels said, his voice grim. "Emily's boyfriend at the time. We questioned him when she went missing, but he had an alibi. Lived out of state for years, though I heard he's back in Cloverfield now. That shed's on the old Miller property. Hasn't been touched in decades. I'll send a team to check it out." Laura hung up, her gaze drifting to Rusty, who was now lying by the back door, his eyes still on the woods. The journal page lay on the counter, its words burning in her mind. Scout knows. Was Rusty connected to Emily's dog? Or was he something more? A guide? A memory? A second chance? She didn't know, but she felt a surge of gratitude for him, for the way he was pulling her family into this mystery, making them whole. When Jake and Sophie got home, Laura showed them the page, keeping her tone light for Sophie's sake. Jake's eyes widened, his fingers tracing the handwriting. Rusty found this in the woods. He looked at the dog with something like awe. Sophie clapped, bouncing on her toes. He's Detective Rusty. He's going to catch the bad guy. Laura laughed, but Jake's expression stayed serious. What if Carter's dangerous? He asked quietly. Laura hesitated, then knelt beside him. We're safe, Jake. The sheriff's handling it, and Rusty's here with us. She glanced at Rusty, who'd moved to Jake's side, pressing his flank against the boy's leg. Jake nodded, his hand resting on Rusty's head, and Laura saw the trust there, the bond that was anchoring her son. That night, the family sat around. The dining table, Jake's Rusty's Clues notebook open. Sophie added a drawing of a red shed, complete with a stick figure Rusty sniffing out secrets. Mark, home from his shift, listened as Laura recounted the day, his jaw tight. This Carter guy, he said, if he's back, we need to be careful. But he softened when Sophie showed him her drawing, taping it to the fridge beside her others. You're right, Soph, Rusty's a hero. As bedtime approached, Rusty followed Jake upstairs, curling up on the blanket at the foot of his bed. Laura tucked Sophie in, reading another dog story. But her mind was on the red shed, on Carter, on what Rusty might find next. Downstairs, she checked the locks, her eyes lingering on the woods. Rusty's soft whine echoed from Jake's room, a reminder that he was still watching, still leading. The mystery was deepening, but so was the Thompson family's connection. Rusty had given them a purpose, a story to share, and Laura knew they'd follow him wherever he led next. By Thursday, the fog had lifted from Cloverfield, leaving the town bathed in a crisp autumn light that made the maples along the Thompson street glow like embers. But inside their home, the air felt charged, as if the journal page Rusty had led Laura to had sparked a current through their lives. The red shed, Carter Hayes and Emily Monroe's words were now threads in a tapestry the family couldn't ignore. Rusty, sensing the shift, spent his mornings by the back door, his amber eyes tracking the woods with a quiet intensity, his limping, gait forgotten in his focus. Laura was folding laundry in the living room when the doorbell rang, a sharp chime that made Rusty lift his head from his bed. She opened the door to find Mrs. Larson, their elderly neighbor, holding a tin of homemade oatmeal cookies. Her white hair was tucked under a knit cap, and her eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Heard your dog's been busy," she said, stepping inside as Laura gestured her in. "Folks can't stop talking about that locket, and now some journal page. Thought I'd bring a little sweetness to balance the strangeness." Sophie, sprawled on the rug with her crayons, perked up. "Rusty's a detective. He found a secret note." She held up her latest drawing, a red shed with Rusty standing triumphantly beside it. Mrs. Larson chuckled, accepting a cookie from Sophie's outstretched hand. "Well, isn't he something? Reminds me of Emily's dog, Scout. That girl loved him like he was her shadow." Laura poured tea, her curiosity piqued. "You knew Emily Monroe?" she asked, setting a mug in front of Mrs. Larson. The older woman nodded, her expression softening. "Oh, yes. Taught third grade at Cloverfield Elementary. Had a laugh that could light up a room. She'd walk Scout through these streets every evening, always stopping to chat. When she went missing in '09, it was like the town lost its heart. Folks searched for weeks. Woods, creeks, even that old red shed on the Miller property. Never found a trace." Jake, who'd been lurking in the hallway with his earbuds dangling, stepped into the room. "The red shed?" he asked, his voice cautious. "That's what the note Rusty found mentioned." Mrs. Larson's eyes widened and she leaned forward. "Is that so? That shed's been empty since the Millers moved away in the '90s. But I remember seeing a dog like Rusty sniffing around there years ago, back when Emily was still here. Could have been Scout, or maybe—" She trailed off, glancing at Rusty, who'd moved to Jake's side, his tail giving a slow wag. Laura's skin prickled. The idea that Rusty might be tied to Emily's dog, even distantly, felt both eerie and comforting. "What about Carter Hayes?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral for Sophie's sake. Mrs. Larson's lips pressed into a thin line. "Carter was trouble. Charming, sure, but always in some scheme. Selling cars that didn't run, borrowing money he never paid back. Emily dated him for a while, but she started pulling away before she vanished. Said he was mixed up in something dark. Nobody could prove it, though. Jake's fingers tightened on Rusty's collar, his face pale. You think he hurt her? Mrs. Larson hesitated, then shrugged. I'm no detective, but Carter left town right after. Didn't sit right with a lot of us. She patted Sophie's head, softening her tone. Your dog's stirring up old. Ghosts, that's for sure. After Mrs. Larson left, the neighborhood seemed to come alive with whispers. Another neighbor, Mr. Patel, stopped by to ask if Rusty could sniff around his garden, half joking about buried treasure. A woman from the library dropped off a book on local history, mentioning Emily's name with a knowing look. By evening, a small crowd had gathered at the end of the Thompsons' driveway, murmuring about the mystery dog. Laura felt a mix of pride and unease. Rusty was becoming a local legend, but the attention was overwhelming. At dinner, the family processed the day over Mark's chili. Sophie, oblivious to the tension, recounted Mrs. Larson's stories, adding her own flair about Rusty battling bad guys with Scout. Jake, usually silent during meals, spoke up. Everyone's acting like Rusty's some superhero. It's kinda cool, but what if they're right? What if he knows stuff about Emily? He looked at Rusty, who was chewing a rawhide bone under the table, his ears twitching at his name. Mark set down his spoon, his firefighter calm, steadying the room. He's definitely special, but we don't know the whole story yet. Let's trust the sheriff and keep Rusty safe. Laura nodded, but her mind was on Mrs. Larson's words about the red shed, Carter's schemes, and the dog that might have been Scout. Rusty's connection to Emily felt like a bridge across time, and the community's stories were filling in the gaps. As bedtime neared, Sophie taped another drawing to the fridge, this one of Rusty and Scout together, guarding a heart-shaped locket. Jake added a note to his Rusty's Clues notebook, Red Shed, Carter, Scout. Laura tucked Sophie in, promising to tell Rusty he was famous. In Jake's room, she found him sitting on the floor, Rusty's head in his lap. Mom, he said, his voice soft. I'm kinda proud of him. Is that weird? Laura knelt, her heart full. Not weird at all. He's giving us something to believe in. Rusty licked Jake's hand, his eyes warm and steady, and Laura felt the mystery binding them closer, a shared adventure with Rusty at its heart. Outside, the wood stood silent, the red shed a distant shadow in her mind. Rusty's soft whine drifted from Jake's room as Laura checked the locks, her gaze lingering on the backyard. The community's stories had deepened the stakes, and she knew Rusty wasn't done leading them. Friday night settled over Cloverfield with a chill that seeped through the Thompsons' windows, the kind of cold that made the house feel both cozy and exposed. Laura sat on the couch, a quilt over her lap, flipping through Jake's Rusty's Clues notebook while the TV murmured in the background. The journal page about the red shed and Carter Hayes lay on the coffee table, its words, Carter's, hiding something etched in her mind. Rusty was curled up beside her, his warmth a quiet comfort, but his ears twitched at every creak of the house, his eyes darting to the back door. Mark was at the fire station for a late shift, and the kids were upstairs, Sophie asleep with her dog book under her pillow, Jake in his attic room, probably sketching in his notebook. The community's stories about Emily Monroe and the red shed had lit a spark in the family, but they'd also cast a shadow. Laura couldn't shake the feeling that Rusty's discoveries were stirring something or someone into motion. Around 10 p.m., Rusty's head snapped up, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Laura froze, her hand pausing on his fur. The growl wasn't playful. It was deep, deliberate, the kind that raised the hairs on her neck. Rusty stood, his limping gait forgotten, and bolted to the back door, his bark sharp and urgent. The sound cut through the house like a siren, and Laura's heart pounded as she followed, flipping on the porch light. The backyard was a pool of shadows, the old stump barely visible in the moonlight. Rusty pressed his nose to the glass, his hackles raised, barking again, 3 quick bursts that echoed into the woods. Laura scanned the yard, her breath shallow. Nothing moved, but the air felt heavy, like eyes were watching from the trees. She grabbed her phone, her thumb hovering over Mark's number, when she noticed something at the back gate, a faint scuff in the dirt. Then another. Footprints, fresh and deep, pressed into the mud along the fence. "Rusty, stay," she whispered, her voice trembling. She slid the door open just enough to lean out, the cold air biting her skin. The footprints led from the gate to the edge of the woods, then vanished into the underbrush. Her stomach churned. Someone had been here. Close. Enough to touch the gate to see into their home. Rusty growled again, his body tense, but he didn't leave her side, his loyalty a shield against the dark. Laura locked the door, double-checked it, and called Sheriff Daniels, her words tumbling out. "There are footprints in the yard, by the gate." Rusty went crazy, like he knew someone was there. Daniels' voice was calm but firm. "I'm sending a deputy now. Stay inside, keep the lights on. Could be a curious neighbor, but we're not taking chances." He paused, then added, "That dog of yours is something else. Keep him close." The deputy arrived within 20 minutes, a young woman named Officer Reyes, who examined the footprints with a flashlight. "Size 10, maybe 11, she said, snapping photos. "No tread pattern, so they're worn boots. Could be a teenager messing around, but I'll file a report. We'll increase patrols around your street." She glanced at Rusty, who'd calmed but still stood guard by the door. "He's a good alarm system." After Reyes left, Laura called Mark, who promised to come home early. She sat up, unable to sleep, Rusty at her feet. The footprints felt like a violation, a crack in the safety of their new life. When Mark arrived, his face was tight with worry. "Nobody's getting near this house," he said, checking the locks and windows. "But we need to be careful. Rusty's kicking up something big." The next morning, Laura told the kids about the footprints, framing it as a nosy visitor to keep Sophie calm. Sophie, eating pancakes, declared, "Rusty scared them away. He's our protector." She drew a new picture of Rusty with a cape, chasing a shadowy figure, and taped it to the fridge. Jake, though, wasn't so easily reassured. "What if it's that Carter guy?" he asked, his voice low as he fed Rusty a piece of bacon. "The one from the note?" Laura exchanged a glance with Mark. "The sheriff's on it, Jake," she said, resting a hand on his shoulder. "And Rusty's got our backs." Jake nodded, but his eyes stayed on Rusty, who'd returned to the back door, his gaze fixed on the gate. The dog's vigilance was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder that he saw things they couldn't. Mark installed a new deadbolt on the back door and a motion sensor light by the gate that afternoon. Laura started carrying her phone everywhere, and Jake took to sleeping with Rusty in his room. The dog's bed moved to the attic. Sophie, blissfully unaware of the growing tension, continued her detective Rusty stories, her drawings piling up. One showed Rusty standing on the red shed, a glowing locket in his mouth, and Laura marveled at how her daughter's imagination turned fear into adventure. That night, Rusty stood guard at Jake's window, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. Laura checked on them, finding Jake asleep with his notebook open, a sketch of Rusty's face staring back. She kissed his forehead, then stroked Rusty's ears. "You're keeping us safe, aren't you?" she whispered. Rusty licked her hand, his eyes warm but alert, and she felt a surge of gratitude. The footprints had shaken them, but they'd also tightened their bond with Rusty as their fearless guide. Outside, the woods were silent, but Laura knew the threat wasn't gone. Rusty's growls had sounded a warning, and the mystery of Emily. Monroe was drawing closer, its edges sharper than ever. Saturday morning broke with a brittle clarity, the Cloverfield sky a pale blue that made the Thompsons' backyard seem both vast and intimate. Laura sipped her coffee at the kitchen table, her eyes on Rusty, who was pacing by the back door, his limping gait more pronounced after his frantic barking the night before. The footprints by the gate had left a lingering unease, and the motion sensor, light Mark installed now, cast a stark glow over the yard at night, catching every rustle of leaves. Sophie, coloring at the table, was adding a crown to her latest drawing of Rusty, while Jake sat quietly, his Rusty's Clues notebook open, a pencil tapping against his lips. Mark, home from an early shift, was checking the new deadbolt when Rusty's behavior shifted. The dog, usually content to watch the yard from the door, began whining, a sharp, insistent sound that made Laura set down her mug. He scratched at the door, his tail stiff, then looked back at her with an urgency that sent a chill down her spine. "He wants out," Jake said, already standing, his sneakers untied. Laura hesitated, the memory of the footprints fresh, but Rusty's focus was undeniable. "Okay," she said, grabbing the leash, "but we stay together." The family followed Rusty into the yard, Sophie clutching her crayon drawing, Mark carrying a flashlight despite the daylight. Rusty didn't head for the stump or the gate. Instead, he pulled toward the woods, his nose low, his leash taut in. Laura's hand. The path was the same one he'd led her down to find the journal page, but this time he veered left, toward a narrow creek that gurgled through the trees. The air was heavy with the scent of moss and damp earth, and Laura's heart thudded as Rusty stopped at a clearing, where a dilapidated red shed stood, its paint peeling like old skin. The shed matched Mrs. Larson's description: sagging roof, boarded windows, vines choking the walls. Rusty barked once, sharp and clear, then sat by the door, his eyes fixed on Laura. Jake's voice was a whisper. "This is it. The red shed from the note." Sophie, clutching Mark's hand, gasped, "Is there treasure inside?" Mark knelt beside her, his voice calm but tense. "Maybe, Soph, let's see what Rusty found." Laura tied Rusty's leash to a nearby tree, his whine soft but steady, as Mark pried open the shed's rusted door. The hinges groaned, revealing a dim interior cluttered with old tools, a broken chair, and a stack of mouldy crates. The air smelled of rot and metal, and Laura's stomach twisted as she stepped inside, her phone's flashlight cutting through the gloom. Rusty barked again, pulling against his leash, and Jake pointed to a corner where the floorboards looked uneven, pried up and hastily replaced. Mark used a crowbar from the shed to lift the boards, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a small leather-bound diary, its cover worn but intact, tied with a frayed ribbon. Laura's hands trembled as she opened it, the pages yellowed but filled with Emily Monroe's neat handwriting. The entries detailed her growing fear of Carter Hayes. "He's meeting people at night, taking money for something illegal. I saw crates in his truck, drugs maybe. I told him I'm done, but he won't let me go." The final entry, dated days before her disappearance, read, "If I don't make it, someone needs to know. Scout's with me. He'll protect my truth." Laura's breath caught, tears pricking her eyes. Jake, peering over her shoulder, whispered, "She knew something bad was coming." Sophie, still outside with Rusty, called, "Did Rusty find it?" Laura nodded, her voice thick. "He did, sweetie. He found something important." Mark called, Sheriff Daniels, who arrived with Officer Reyes within the hour. They cordoned off the shed, photographing the diary and the compartment. Daniels flipped through the pages, his face grim. "This is big," he said. "Emily was onto Carter's dealings. Sounds like smuggling, maybe worse. We've got eyes on him now. He's been spotted in town. This diary could be the key to reopening her case." Rusty, untied from the tree, stayed close to Sophie, who'd sat on a stump, her drawing forgotten. She stroked his fur, her voice soft. "You're so brave, Rusty. You found the lady's book." Rusty licked her hand, his eyes warm but alert, as if he knew the danger wasn't gone. Laura watched them, her heart swelling with gratitude. Rusty had led them to the truth, but he'd also kept Sophie calm, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. Back home, the family gathered in the living room, the diary's weight lingering in the air. Jake added the find to his notebook, his handwriting shaky with excitement. "Rusty's 2 for 2, he said, a rare grin breaking through. Sophie taped her crown drawing to the fridge, declaring Rusty king of clues. Mark pulled Laura close, his voice low. "He's changing us, you know, making us braver." Laura nodded, her eyes on Rusty, who'd curled up by the back door, his gaze still on the woods. The diary had cracked the mystery wide open, but it had also raised the stakes. Carter was out there, and Rusty's vigilance told her he sensed it. Yet in that moment, the family felt stronger, bound by their trust in a scruffy mutt who'd become their guide. The Thompson household woke on Sunday to a quiet that felt earned, like the calm after a storm that had raged too long. The Red Shed's diary, now in Sheriff Daniels's hands, had shifted the air in Cloverfield, turning whispers into headlines. Laura stood at the kitchen counter, slicing apples for Sophie's lunch, her eyes drifting to Rusty, who lay by the back door. His limping gait had returned after yesterday's trek to the shed, but his amber eyes were calm, his tail giving a slow wag, as if he sensed the end of a long journey. The backyard, once a place of secrets, now felt like theirs again. The old stump just a stump under the morning sun. Jake was at the table, his Rusty's Clues notebook open, but instead of writing, he was sketching Rusty's face, capturing the dog's scruffy fur and soulful gaze. Sophie, in her dog-themed sweatshirt, was adding glitter to a new drawing, a heart-shaped locket with Rusty's name inside. Mark, sipping coffee, caught Laura's eye and smiled. "Feels different today, doesn't it?" he said, his voice soft. Laura nodded, her heart full. Rusty had led them through fear and uncertainty, and now they stood on the other side, closer than ever. The breakthrough came faster than they expected. Sheriff Daniels called just after breakfast, his voice steady but triumphant. "Carter Hayes is in custody," he said. "Picked him up last night at a motel outside town." The diary was the nail in the coffin. Emily's entries tied him to a smuggling ring, drugs mostly, running through Cloverfield back in her '09. "We found evidence in his truck, same kind of crates she described. He's not talking much, but we've got enough to charge him with trafficking and likely Emily's murder." Laura's breath caught. "Murder?" Daniels sighed. "Yeah, based on the diary and some old case files. We searched a patch of land near the red shed this morning. Found remains, human, female. Forensics is confirming, but we're almost certain it's Emily. Buried shallow, not far from where Rusty led you, that dog he knew." Hanging up, Laura shared the news with Mark, her voice trembling. Jake, overhearing, set down his pencil, his face pale but resolute. "Rusty found her," he said almost to himself. Sophie, catching the mood, climbed into Laura's lap. "Is the lost lady okay now?" she asked, her eyes wide. Laura hugged her tight, choosing her words carefully. "She's at peace, sweetie." Rusty made sure of it. The community moved quickly to honor Emily. By midweek, a memorial was planned in Cloverfield's town square, a simple gathering to remember the teacher who'd vanished 15 years ago. The Thompsons attended, Rusty on a leash at Jake's side, his limp barely noticeable as he walked with a quiet dignity. The square was filled with faces, neighbors like Mrs. Larson, Emily's former students, even strangers who'd followed. The story in the local paper. A small plaque was unveiled near a park bench where Emily used to read, inscribed, "In memory of Emily Monroe, forever in our hearts." Jake, to Laura's surprise, asked to speak. He stood by the plaque, Rusty sitting calmly at his feet, and cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the crowd. "Rusty's just a dog," he said, "but he found things nobody else could. He brought Emily back to us, not just her stuff, but her story. I think he was her friend like he's mine now." His words hung in the air, and Laura felt tears prick her eyes as the crowd applauded, some wiping their own. Sophie, holding Mark's hand, whispered, "Rusty's a hero, Daddy." Mark nodded, his arm around Laura, his own eyes glistening. Rusty lay still during the ceremony, his head high, his gaze on the plaque as if he understood. Mrs. Larson approached afterward, her hands clasped. "That dog was Emily's guardian, and now he's yours," she said, patting Rusty's head. "She'd be so proud." Jake smiled, a rare open grin, and scratched Rusty's ears, the dog leaning into him with a soft huff. Back home, the family felt lighter, as if the mystery's weight had lifted. Sophie taped her glittery locket drawing to the fridge, declaring it Rusty's medal. Jake added a final entry to his notebook. Emily found. Case closed. Laura and Mark sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint a golden glow over the woods. "He did more than solve a mystery," Laura said, her voice soft. "He made us a family." Mark squeezed her hand. "And gave Emily justice. That's a hell of a dog." Rusty, lying on the porch steps, looked up at his name, his tail thumping once. His eyes were softer now, less watchful, as if the red shed and the woods had released their hold. The town square memorial had closed a chapter, but Laura knew Rusty's story, their story, was far from over. He'd brought them closure, yes, but also hope, a reminder that even the smallest creatures could carry the weight of truth. The Thompson household settled into a gentle rhythm in the weeks following Emily Monroe's memorial, as if Cloverfield's autumn had softened the edges of their world. The backyard, once a stage for Rusty's discoveries, now hosted Sophie's games of tag and Jake's quiet moments, sketching under the old stump. Laura stood at the kitchen window one crisp October morning, watching the leaves fall in lazy spirals, her coffee mug warm against her hands. Rusty lay on his bed by the fireplace, his black and tan fur catching the sunlight, his limping gait eased by rest and the vet's care. His amber eyes were calm, no longer fixed on the woods, and Laura felt a quiet gratitude for the dog who'd changed everything. The mystery of Emily Monroe had woven the Thompsons together, and its resolution left them stronger, their home no longer just a house, but a haven. Sophie, bouncing into the kitchen in her dog-themed sweatshirt, was already planning Rusty's hero party, complete with a paper crown she'd crafted. "He needs a celebration, Mommy," she said, taping her latest drawing to the fridge, a beaming Rusty surrounded by hearts and stars. Laura laughed, ruffling her hair. "You're right, sweetie, he deserves it." Jake, now a regular at the breakfast table instead of hiding in his attic room, was working on a story for a school project. His Rusty's Clues notebook traded for a laptop. "It's about a dog who solves mysteries," he told Laura, his voice shy but proud. "Kinda like Rusty, but with, made-up stuff." He glanced at Rusty, who thumped his tail, as if approving the creative license. Laura smiled, her heart swelling. Jake's walls were crumbling, his confidence blooming, and she knew Rusty was the spark. Mark, home from a fire station shift, joined them, his presence a steady anchor. He'd started calling Rusty Captain, a nod to the dog's leadership, and the nickname stuck. "Captain's looking good today," he said, tossing Rusty a treat, which the dog caught with a gentle snap. "Think he's ready to retire from detective work." Laura caught his eye, both of them knowing Rusty's work had been about more than clues. It had been about healing. The community, too, had shifted. Cloverfield's town square now felt like a place of renewal. The plaque, for Emily Monroe, a quiet reminder of truth and resilience. Neighbors stopped by with small gifts for Rusty, a chew toy from Mrs. Larson, a bone from Mr. Patel, each visit a testament to the dog's impact. The local paper ran a feature on Cloverfield's hero dog, with a photo of Rusty sitting proudly by Jake at the memorial. Sophie cut it out, taping it beside her drawings, while Jake, embarrassed but pleased, muttered, "He's just a dog." One evening, as the family grilled burgers in the backyard, Rusty did something new. Instead of watching the woods or pacing by the gate, he chased a squirrel across the grass, his bark playful, his limp barely noticeable. Sophie squealed, running after him, while Jake laughed, tossing a ball for Rusty to fetch. Laura watched, her throat tight with joy. "He's happy," she said to Mark, who was flipping burgers with a grin. "Really happy." Mark nodded, pulling her close. "We all are, this place, it's home now." He gestured to the yard, the house, the kids, Rusty. He made it ours. Laura leaned into him, watching Sophie crown Rusty with her paper creation, Jake snapping a photo with his phone. The moment felt like a promise, a new chapter written in barks and laughter. That night, after Sophie was tucked in with a story about a dog hero and Jake was in his room, typing his story, Laura and Mark sat on the couch, a candle flickering on the coffee table. Rusty curled up by the fireplace, his bed now a permanent fixture in the living room. Laura reached for Jake's notebook, flipping to the final entry. Emily found. Case closed. Below it he'd added in smaller script, "Rusty's the best thing that ever happened to us." "He's right," Laura whispered, her voice thick. Mark squeezed her hand, his eyes on Rusty, who let out a soft huff in his sleep as if agreeing. The woods outside were silent, no longer a place of secrets, but a backdrop to their lives. Laura thought of Emily, of the locket, the diary, the red shed, and how Rusty had carried her truth to them, piece by piece. He'd given them justice, yes, but also something deeper, a family forged in trust and love. The next day, Jake presented his story at school, earning a standing ovation from his class. Sophie drew Rusty as captain of Cloverfield, her artwork displayed at the library. Mark hung a photo of the family with Rusty on the living room wall, taken during a hike where Rusty had romped through a creek, splashing them all. Life moved forward, full of small joys: Rusty's playful barks, Sophie's giggles, Jake's smiles, Mark's steady presence. As Laura locked the back door that night, her gaze lingered on the backyard, now a place of play, not mystery. Rusty stood beside her, his tail wagging, no longer fixated on the woods. She knelt, stroking his ears. "You did it, Captain," she said. "You brought us home." Rusty licked her hand, his eyes warm, and followed her inside, ready for whatever came next.